Hello and welcome to BA Brew. I'm Mike.
Hello, I'm Steve.
And I'm Pete.
And today we are talking about non-functional requirements. This was a subject that was suggested to us by Steve. So Steve, could you tell us why you thought this was a sensible subject to talk about on the BA Brew?
Yes, thanks. It came about because I don't know if people remember it, probably close to 2 years ago now, but it hit the news that there was a problem with the test and trace system, as it was called there, where something like 16,000 records were missing. And there was a lot of chatter on things like radio talking shows and such like, and people saying, oh, they shouldn't have picked Excel and they didn't test it properly and things like that. And I sat there and I thought, I don't know that it is about Excel or about testing. It sounded like, to me, that because they'd been doing this quite rapidly and understandably, they were, under the cosh there, that they hadn't really realised how many records they were going to have to capture, and hadn't realised how many records Excel or the version of Excel they had were able to hold at any one time. So it may not have been that. And by the way, if anybody's listening who's working on this project, I'm not here to have a go. I've worked on some pretty tough projects myself, and people have to make rapid calls. But it sounded like a non-functional requirements thing. And I come across sites nowadays that I'm trying to put it delicately. Sometimes you find that the BA think, or that the organisation says, well, actually, non-functional requirements have nothing to do with the BA. It's all IT, is that? Or, we have a list of non-functional requirements for the whole organisation. We don't need to worry about it. And I'm sure that in this case with the Excel spreadsheet, that may not be the case, but it just fed to me that idea that we don't really take non-functional seriously enough. So that's why I thought it'd be a good topic for us to discuss today.
So the plan today is to talk about non-functional requirements in a serious way. And on that note, I need to stop talking and hand over to Pete, because I can't string a serious sentence together for very long.
It's serious, but sort of light-hearted. I just wanted to give an example here, which was back in 2015 when the Apple App Store crashed. When apparently, and I just need to look up, make sure I get my statistics right here. It was with the release of the new Kimoji app, which of course I know intimately, being an avid follower of Kim Kardashian. But it was something to do with Kim Kardashian. And although Apple predicted that they were going to have a spike in downloads when this was launched, people were downloading these, I can't quite believe it myself, at the rate of 9,000 per millisecond. And, to some extent, you've got to have some sympathy for Apple here, haven't you? They no doubt take non-functionals very, very seriously. But it's not just a case of thinking, all right, we're going to get a lot of these, aren't we? All right, we'll put a non-functional requirement in there to say, right, we need to account for big quantities of downloads or lots of concurrent hits. I think it's more of a science than that. I think you've got to kind of try and be as precise as you can. You've got to build up sort of empirical evidence of how much historically and what the growth rates are. And I think not only is it something that people probably don't take seriously, but don't realise how complex they can be to define properly.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's quite a lot of examples of things like that where people seem to have been caught out. So I think when the pandemic first started and people weren't able to go to supermarkets, the online supermarket presences, the websites just crashed because there was just so many people trying to go and use them. So they had to implement these throttling systems. And I do remember going onto one of those and seeing I was 10,000th in the queue, and I can't remember how many hours it said I was going to have to wait, but I was thinking, this is not good. But that was a kind of rapid response to fix a problem because everything was just taken down, and there must be all sorts of things. And that test and trace thing, I don't know whether that spreadsheet was ever meant to be the live solution or whether that was a quick win that somebody demonstrated in something and they said, let's do that. And they haven't necessarily thought it, whenever it was implemented, it wasn't necessarily thought through. Mm-hmm. Who needs to do that thinking through? Whose responsibility is that? Because there's quite a breadth of responsibility there, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it is as a BA, I would want to take on that. To me, it's my responsibility to get those requirements understood. And I agree, that's an interesting one. I hadn't really thought that the spreadsheet may well have been somebody just trying to demonstrate how this could be done.
Yes.
And these things run away with themselves. And as we know, that time
there's lots of examples, aren't there, of short-term tactical solutions that become long-term strategic solutions, just because other things.
And it's not a popular. It's not popular as the BA to be the one that says, "Hang on a minute, let's just think about this." But that was a real live example of where let's just think about this could have saved quite a bit of hassle. I mean, who knows? I don't want to get over dramatic. For all we know, it could have saved a life there. We just don't know because 16,000 people weren't traced.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you should say about saving lives. I mean, there are some, life critical and safety critical solutions out there that, if they do get it wrong, you can lose lives, can't you? Like an air traffic control system. If they get it wrong, in terms of, suddenly, we can't cope with any more flights, because we got that bit wrong. I mean, it could literally lead to disaster, couldn't it? So obviously, something like that, because the stakes are very high, no doubt these things are rigorously researched and tested and what have you. But I think, sometimes maybe people with sort of everyday type applications just think, clearly they need to do it, but we don't need to do it because it's just a simple, whatever it is. But even, a few hours of downtime, can cause a negative reaction, can't it? I mean, it can be a bad image for the company, which could lead to a loss of business, which is actually very difficult to try and quantify, isn't it? So
I was just thinking about this and just thinking, actually, we might need to contextualize this for some people, because whilst we're comfortable talking about non-functional requirements and happy talking about what are functional requirements and non-functional requirements, some people might not be. So what's the difference between a functional requirement and a non-functional requirement for those people that might be confused? And to be honest, I might be confused after this. Who knows?
I can try. One of our esteemed colleagues, Dave Beckham, came up with an analogy the other week when I was talking to him about this, and it's about ordering a meal in a restaurant. So you order your meal, and you want your meal to be nice, yeah. You order your meal that you want, but you want it to be delivered within a certain time scale. You don't want to be waiting all day for it. You want it within a reasonable 20 minutes, something like that. So the functional requirement is the meal that you ordered, and the non-functional requirement is the time that you want it to be delivered. As an example, I did get into a bit of thinking about, actually, when you say I want a nice meal, whether the word nice is actually also a non-functional requirement, because it's around usability.
Yeah, because the meal is the function of the meal, the nutrition. Yeah. And actually all of the other elements are the temperature, the how tasty it is, how well presented it is, which is much more, it's quite different. What are your thoughts, Pete, on that?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, I teach requirements engineering, so obviously, I'm used to explaining the party line as to what the difference is. And we've got some fairly clear examples, but I think sometimes it is a bit of a grey area, because I mean, I've always said, look, functional requirements basically define the required functionality of the solution. So anything that someone needs to be able to do within the solution would be seen as a functional thing. And then the non-functional ones are more the sort of service level requirements. So pretty much exactly what you've been talking about, really. It's not what it does in terms of what the meal is. It's about how quickly you can actually get that service and things like that. And that, I mean, there are lots of different things that do come under non-functional requirements, but I think things like performance, usability, accessibility, availability, it's not so much about what the solution needs to be able to do, but it's more about the way that is delivered as a solution.
I've seen a very brief description of functional requirements as the things that it will do, and the non-functionals are how it will be, which I think actually is quite a reasonable one, although I'm sure there'll be examples of where that doesn't quite fit. The other challenge is sometimes we talk about the illities or the ities, and then you get the confusion because some of those there are non-functional requirements around security, and there'll be functional requirements around security. So that kind of blurs the lines at times. So.
But I've had people on courses, getting very confused, and we've had like examples and said, like, what type of requirement is this? And sometimes, people pick up on words like and phrases like on demand. This facility shall be available on demand. And I think, well, I don't class that as a non-functional requirement, because I think everything is on demand, isn't it? If you said that, this had to be scheduled at a specific time to be initiated, then yes, you're getting a little bit closer. But there's always going to be these grey areas, I think. Is that actually an integral part of the functionality when it gets triggered, if you see what I mean? Business rules is another one. Business rules are actually, to me, integral to the functionality. So I wouldn't say that they're particularly non-functional, unless they were a non-functional business rule, like performance and availability. So I think it is quite a difficult area for a lot of people, even people that are very experienced. In the world of business analysis, it's those grey areas that sometimes, cause a lot of the uncertainty, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's part of me wants to say, I almost don't care how you categorise it. It's more about, at least I want our BAs to be thinking about it.
Yes. Yeah.
So knowing, what types of non-functional requirement there are, that we've got to think about security, we've got to think about availability and performance and things like that. It's about having that curiosity to ask a little bit more about some of the functional requirements so that you've fully understood it. And thinking about what the business is trying to achieve with this change.
Yeah.
Who are the customers of this? Do they want it to be, 24/7 instant? Or actually, does it matter? It's that really getting underneath it, because it will have an important implication when whatever it is that they're designing, the solution gets delivered.
I think that's a good point, actually, Steve, because I think the trouble is when people don't have that on their radar and don't consider it earlier, it comes to light later on. If you're lucky, it comes to light during testing. But it could well come to light during live operational use, where, of course, the stakes are much higher. But even if it comes to light in testing, you spent a significant amount of money building something that then has to be unraveled and redone to meet the non-functional requirements. And sometimes these are pretty fundamental to things like the overarching design. And you would have done it completely different if you'd have realized that you needed to achieve this level of performance. So having it on the agenda early is absolutely essential, isn't it? Rather than thinking, oh, well, it doesn't matter because it'll come up later on. Well, no, that's not a good place to be.
And back to my spreadsheet example, it may not come up in testing.
Well, yes,
because clearly nobody pumped enough records through that to get that problem flushed out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's a good point.
But it is about thinking. Back to your point, it's about thinking about it early enough, isn't it?
So, are there ways that we're approaching things that exacerbate the problem? Are there things that we're doing now that make it a bit more tricky with the speed of approach, the level of agility that organisations are supposed to demonstrate?
Well, I think something that Steve mentioned, about this idea that some people think, oh, there's this sort of central set of non-functional requirements, and almost it's kind of almost dismissive that, oh yeah, right, we've got it covered. Don't worry, we've got a central set of non-functional requirements. It's all good. And this overemphasis in some respects on user stories, which primarily are functional requirements. It's what someone needs to be able to do in the system. So unless you kind of have a way of thinking about it early on, like, for example, when you're defining acceptance criteria and confirmations for a story, start to get it on the agenda there and think, okay, well, look, you've described what you need, but what about these things? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So it becomes an integral part of the conversation rather than a bit of an afterthought. Yes, I think
a number of places I've worked at, we've built up a bit of a library of non-functional requirements, but that was never meant to be, and here are the non-functional requirements. It's, we've learned about this stuff, here's a whole load of stuff that may be appropriate, and you may find there are other things that are appropriate for the specific project, but use that resource rather than having to recreate something and get the discussion going. So I quite like the idea of a catalogue, but not as it's already done. That's a discussion point.
It's a checklist in a sense, isn't it? I mean, I've got a book actually that I bought many years ago called Software Requirements Patterns. And actually what it is not a set of standard, here are some ready-made requirements for you, but it's a set of patterns. And it says, like, if you're looking at this sort of thing, these are the things you need to consider. And it is really just a sort of more contextual checklist to say, well, when we're looking in these areas, we also need to think about these and have this conversation. And this is how you might be able to define that more precisely, just to have those sort of patterns and templates almost that people can start to use.
Yeah, Mike, I've come across organisations who have the central catalogue, and some of them just kind of assume it's somebody else's problem, but I have also seen, and I think this works well, organisations where they have a very clear process where you take them from the catalogue and you review it and you go through it and you say, which of these apply to us? How do they apply? Is it that requirement, or is our project slightly different? So we need to change that requirement. I think if you do that and be a bit more rigorous about it, then you're more likely to get a good outcome.
Yeah, I think I remember many years ago, I worked in the civil service, and there was we had some guidance from CCTA. Do you remember CCTA? And there were a set of performance guidance. So it said if it's something that's online, you need this sort of speed, and if it was a report, then that could be up to 4 hours or something. Can you imagine waiting that long for a report to run now? But so there were a set of guidelines which we then apply to the different situations. I'm not sure now. There's so much more stuff out there and so many more things to think about. I don't know you could easily do that with a set of guidelines like that.
I would always encourage people to, I don't want to say challenge in a harsh sense, but just challenge, is that the right requirement for us? Is it? Is that the requirement might, the catalogue might say that all our systems are available, 365, 24/7, and so on. Well, actually, does my change need that level of availability?
Absolutely,
really? Yeah. Or are there certain hours when this is required, but not others? Because that helps at least with peaks and troughs. The IT guys can understand how to configure things.
Interestingly, that some of those discussions were easier to have when you say, well, if you want that 24/7, 365, this is how much it's going to cost. And actually that starts some of those discussions, isn't it? But some of those things are not quite so easy to quantify. It's not quite so straightforward.
No, and the other thought that leads off that, I did wonder if, I don't want to use the word complacency. These things are always a bit judgmental, but in this world of everything's 24/7, everything's on the cloud, software as a service, and all the rest, you think, it doesn't really matter. We just kind of stick it on the cloud, we're fine. But often when you're buying a service, the licenses are geared around things like number of users, how concurrent users, how much you want to, and it can lead to you making some bad calls when you're signing up an agreement with a software service provider. Either you end up paying too much for what you're getting, or worse, is you implement it and you find halfway down the line you need more, and suddenly you're having to spend quite a lot. Yeah.
It's a good point, Steve, because I think coming down to sort of off-the-shelf, ready-made solutions, which are becoming more prevalent because organisations are thinking, well, why should we build our own thing when there's something that's available that's just as good? So when people kind of evaluate those and define their requirements, if indeed they do define requirements, sometimes they think, well, this is ready-made, so they're all much of a muchness. Let's get 3 or 4 demos in, and we'll look, we'll pick the one that we like best. It's probably not the most scientific way of doing it. You still need requirements so that you can, do a gap analysis and decide where it meets your needs and where it's not meeting your needs. But I think, again, that's one of those areas where people don't think of the non-functionals. Yes, you could have a tick box and say, does it do this? Does it do that? But what about the non-functionals? They're almost like the small print that's likely to catch you out downstream. And that's just as critical and as difficult, if not more difficult, to negotiate, for a ready-made off-the-shelf solution.
So I'm just wondering then, what are your recommendations, your key recommendations to business analysts in the realm of non-functional requirements?
Look, for me, it's going to be get it on the agenda from the outset. Make sure that you've got a checklist somewhere of typical types of non-functional requirements. And when you're doing your elicitation or certainly analysis of requirements, go through that checklist and say, have we covered this? And it literally, checklists are brilliant for things like that because, I'm getting older and my memory is terrible, but actually we're all only human anyway. So to have a checklist to go through, just make sure you do it more thoroughly. So that will be my top tip, I think. But Steve may have some others.
No, very similar. It is literally to have it on the agenda and not be afraid. If you're working in an organisation where typically it's not the role of the BA, don't be afraid to ask, well, where are the non-functional requirements? And the other one, I think, is be curious. I mean, I just think that's an inherent trait of being a business analyst, is being a bit curious around the non-functional side of what it is you're defining the requirements for. Think about what those implications might be if you don't really get those things nailed down.
Maybe start the conversation with your more technical colleagues as well, so that it's not, ultimately, yes, I think, it's something that is there for the BA to raise as an issue, but BAs aren't specialists in non-functional requirements.
No, and that's the challenge, isn't it?
They don't know all of the detail. They're the facilitator. So have those conversations, with the testers and with the developers, with the solution architects, to say, look, can you help us maybe to come up with a standard template for defining some of these non-functional requirements that just make it a bit more predictable for future projects.
Yeah, maybe some of it is about trying to engage people in that by making them aware of the risks or reminding them of when something didn't go quite so well because of a non-functional that wasn't thought about, or sharing experiences from the App Store, or what was it you were saying earlier, the test and trace spreadsheet. So sharing some of those stories might get people a bit more interested, because it's kind of difficult to engage people in that. Anyway, I'd like to say thank you very much for raising this as a subject, Steve, and thank you, Pete, for joining us, and thank you to all our audience as well for joining us today. What I would like to say is, well, if you do have any ideas for future episodes of the BA Brew, then please email us. We're always keen to hear your suggestions, and you may even be able to join us on the show. So if you'd like to email us, our email address is babrew@assistkd.com. Thanks a lot, and see you again soon.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.